Okay, hello everybody. I am here today with FB, also known as Fat Baby Funds. Really dope name. I'll put their Twitter below so you can follow them. They are a Spotify bull. Spotify is the largest position that they have in their portfolio. So this is going to be a fun discussion, getting to see sort of where their perspective comes from and ultimately how they came to the conclusion that they want to be a big bull on Spotify. But before we get into it, FB, can you just introduce a little bit about who you are, how long you've been investing, and I guess when you started kind of publicly, I went through your blog talking about your investment theses and expressing uh, basically your thoughts on how you invest.
Yeah, so I'm Fat Baby. You can call me Ian too. That's either one works. Um, but I've been really investing for 3 years, sort of intensively, and before that, 3 or 4 years, sort of more passively. Um, and then I've been blogging on it, really trying to do a lot of things transparently, trying to do it a little different, just because uh, you see a lot of the investment community who sort of hide some of their thoughts. That's why I thought having a blog was so cool. Like, you post it there and you can go back and read and the dumb things you said 3 years ago and hopefully learn from it. So I'm not pretending that I know everything here, and I've made a lot of mistakes. I've made some good decisions, and hopefully keep learning from them. So that's really what I'm chasing after, is just being transparent, putting a lot of my decisions into text, into whatever medium I can, and then really going to look back on it in a few years, and try and learn from it.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a really cool thing. I mean, I've definitely made a lot of mistakes. All of us have. And it's cool because when you publicly document it, then everyone can know how much of a
Yeah.
mistake you made, not just you yourself. Um, Okay, cool. So what happened 3 years ago that kind of got you started to invest? Were you doing anything before that where you thought about it, but you never took the plunge, and then 3 years ago it kind of just happened?
Yeah. So, I mean, a while ago, probably 2017, I got into Bitcoin.
Okay.
And so then I really liked Bitcoin, and that's where I was putting a lot of my money. And then in 2019, I sort of made a big jump career wise from being a financial analyst to being a VP of finance. And so
Wow.
with that came a lot more money. And then it's also the realization, okay, I've been putting all my money into Bitcoin. I probably should diversify a little bit into something that's not crypto. Uh, and so I'm still bullish on Bitcoin. I've never sold any of my Bitcoin, but really been shifting my funds that I've been putting in into a lot of other places. So then I really started looking at it. Before then, I did a little bit of trading, but it was all just random ins and outs. The first stock I ever bought was Twitter, and it's sort of been a love affair of mine ever since. But one of those terrible love affairs, if you know what I'm saying, with Twitter
Yeah.
stock. But then eventually in Spotify IPO'd. I always thought it was an interesting company. And then about a year after its IPO is when I really started to dive in. I try not to dive into and buy IPOs too early. To
Right.
me, it's just it's worth waiting. And I did it, and even then with Spotify, it's if I would have waited longer, it probably would have been better, because there's been a lot of opportunity to get it at a good price. Um, and
Yeah.
that's really what got me into investing, is just sort of having that opportunity to have extra funds. And it's like, okay, what am I going to do with all this?
Yeah. And I mean, the entire market is corrected. So whether it was Spotify or any stock, quite frankly, it's everything's on sale now. And relatively cheap where it was from a year ago. Because I don't think any of us expected some of the discounts we were getting, but nonetheless, they're here. Now we gotta
Yeah.
gotta see what we can do. All right, so let's get fully into it. I guess I want to give you the floor before I get into some specific questions. You can give me like sort of a 2 minute TLDR. If you want to take it to 3, 4 minutes, that's fine. But I mean, Spotify is, I believe, 14% of your portfolio. It is the top stock in a world in which there's companies like Tesla and Palantir and Arc Innovation and even boring stocks like Costco. What makes Spotify the number one for you right now?
Yeah. So, really, what I like about Spotify is that they've been dominating the audio industry. When you step back and look at it, they've defeated Apple, who has a crazy advantage over them. Apple has a huge advantage over a ton of companies. And in the audio industry, they had an even bigger advantage. They were podcasting for the longest time, and they had the opportunity to dominate music. Spotify beat them. Google, I wouldn't say Spotify is beaten, just because YouTube is a monster and YouTube Music is still gaining a lot of market share. But Spotify has dominated them. And they've gone through this, and there's a few other random competitors who don't, Amazon Music and Pandora and all that kind of stuff. But when you step back and look at it, Spotify's dominated from an operation standpoint. Now, the problem is, okay, that's all good. They haven't made any money.
Yeah.
So that's really where the point I stand at is, okay, when I look at it from an operating standpoint, I'm incredibly bullish. So the question is, can they make money? And that's where, when I look at it, step back, I see the paths to it. I'm a little different than some other Spotify bulls because I think their path is a little more indirect. I'm a big lover of optionality, and I think they have a ton of optionality into making money. I don't think it's going to be directly from taking money from the labels. I don't see that as their path. And when you listen to Spotify management, there's a reason they're never talking about that. Their relationship with artists will be frayed if that happens. And that's just not the direction Spotify wants to go from. It's expanding the pie, going into new verticals, all of that. And they've proven with podcasts, better or worse, that they can dominate it. Now, they did the same thing with podcasts they did with music. They're not making any money in it. They're actively losing a lot of money in podcasts, but they're dominating podcasts. So the question is, okay, back to the start. Can they make money? I see the path to it. And a big part of that is advertising as well. But there's a lot of other options within it. And I think that's where the optionality really comes into play.
Okay. So I have a bunch of questions. I want to talk about music and then podcasts in particular. But before I get to the music question, so yes, the company's not making a lot of money. There's a bunch of companies in tech right now that are not making money. One of the biggest bull cases I have is a company, Palantir, not making any money. But the reason I'm so heavily invested, it's really like 65, 70% of my portfolio is because just like you, I see that path to massive levels of growth, which inevitably leads to gap profitability. And then the market sort of corrects itself and understands what to value the company as. For Spotify to be like the top position for you, obviously it's totally fine if they don't make money right now, because that's the nature of investing in growth companies. But you would have to see a path to profitability that is so strong, I guess, in the next 7 to 8 years, however long you plan to hold it, that it justifies a real tech premium on the stock. So do you see or do you buy into Daniel Ek's vision of like 1 billion MAUs by 2030? Or do you think they're going to, metaphorically beat the labels that like not necessarily how you think they get to profitability, but do you think they are just so dominant and they have so many users that inevitably, like for me, for Palantir, I think they just get so many deals that inevitably leads to profitability? Is that kind of what you see on a macro for Spotify over the next decade?
Yeah, essentially, they're halfway to the billion right now, and they can leverage those users into a lot of different paths, and that's exactly what they did with podcasts. Now, when you dive into it, you got to make money, and that's where advertising is going to be the key. When you get that advertising engine going, it opens up so many different possibilities, and because essentially, once you build that network and you have that, it essentially opens up a whole new monetization scheme, which makes it a lot easier to go into other verticals. So if
Right.
their music advertising business, which historically they never cared about because that money was essentially just going to the labels and it was a way to funnel people into their premium business, if they had that in a better place before, podcasting would be in a whole different spot than it was now. And that's sort of what they're building right now with their advertising network. And so it's going to be, it's good. That's the possibility I see, is that ads open up everything, but there's a lot on top of ads that reduces the risk that it's not solely reliant on their advertising network driving complete success, because there's enough there. When you start to aggregate that many users, monetization will find you.
Right. Okay. So before we get into podcasts, which is a really unique conversation, I guess I want to start with music, and I guess I want to push back a little bit on the last sentence you said, which is that if they have the users, they'll find monetization, even if ads aren't the crux of it. The way I think of Spotify and the way I understand them is 2006, Daniel Ek has a vision that illegal streaming is horrible. What if we make this one beautifulized, centralized, essentially Google search engine for music? And as a result of that, can we get millions of people to pay a monthly subscription but get access to all the music they want? It was going to kill the music industry in the traditional way, but the music industry was already dying. And so as a result of that, this was the next best option. The problem that I see from an investment perspective when it comes to music is you don't own any of the content. So like even YouTube, like when people upload videos to YouTube, YouTube doesn't literally own it, but they own the content, right? Because where else are you going to post your video to get that level of distribution with that level of traffic and the level of analytics and monetization? We can get into all of that. With Spotify, at the end of the day, it's just an app. Like I can listen to music everywhere. Spotify has a phenomenal UI, phenomenal, I would argue, better than other app music discovery algorithms, even though it probably could be better, but it has the interface and user experience to get people hooked. I mean, even things like Spotify Wrapped, they're so innovative on versus other companies that just don't take advantage of that. But as you said, they can't make money off the music because even if they increase their subscription prices, like Sony, UMG, they're going to take a good chunk of that because you can't be charging $20 a month and not paying the artists and the record labels and all those companies the music. The one answer to this is, well, what if you just sign the artist directly? And I think they tried this a couple years ago, and Sony threatened to like pull everybody off if they even think of doing that again. And so Spotify's like, all right, we're not going to try to sign them directly. We're not going to try to be the label, which is kind of my bull case. Like, why don't you just be the label and then you have the artist direct? But obviously it's very hard to do that with the record labels. In a world in which in India, they're charging $2 a month to get access to premium, and they're massively for if you're in college, you can pay $5 a month for 4 years, which is what I did to like that. It's just a losing money proposition. It's blitz scaling at the highest of levels to get user growth, but it's not monetizable on the back end. And even if you increase the subscription, it's still not monetizable because the labels have to get a piece of that. So I guess my question here is there a bull case for music, or do you agree that music simply can never be profitable in the way that the music industry is structured? It's not even really Spotify's fault. And as a result of that, podcast should really be the only discussion of the bull case in advertising because music just doesn't make money.
No, music can make money. Music will never make crazy amounts of money. But if I step back and look at it, I think they can get to a reasonable level of profitability, net income 5%, maybe 10%. And when I'm saying that, there's some assumptions going into that on the marketplace, things like that, where when I'm talking about their advertising network, even if that fails, there's going to be other forms of advertising, which is like their marketplace, that will allow different ways around the royalties. And I do think over time there are other options for Spotify to slowly raise their margins, like they've been historically, going from 15% margins up to 25, 30,
25, right?
yeah. And it's actually better than that for music. That's what one of the big takeaways from their investor day was. Music's actually doing better than people think, and podcast is doing a lot worse than people think.
Yeah.
And so I do think music isn't a net zero option out there. I think there's right now, with the way it's built, I think Spotify could be profitable in music alone without looking at any other verticals. I think it could be a standalone company. It just would be trading like.
Would that come from subscriptions or music ads, you think? Or I know the record labels pay billions to in promotional fees for playlisting. Is that a way you think they could?
Yeah. And I mean, that's when I'm talking about the marketplace, that's really what I'm talking about. Gotcha. And it's really a different form of advertising. And when I'm talking about aggregating mass users, that's the kind of stuff that finds your way there. And there's always going to be other opportunities. I've never been crazy into the idea of Spotify becoming Live Nation or anything like that. Yeah. But Spotify being the advertising network for Live Nation, Spotify really driving a lot of the merch sales, all that kind of stuff. That the market's not huge in that for Spotify. I don't think, but there's enough there to support a 5% net income type company. Now, that's not anything to be crazy bullish on, but I think it is a certain level of safety that makes me feel comfortable as an investor that significantly reduces my risk because I see that as a floor with other options on top of it. And maybe those options are more bullish where they do get more aggressive with record labels. I don't see that coming, but it is an option.
Right. Okay, so let's get into podcasting then. That's, I think, the big discussion. So look, a little bit of background around me. I am the only reason I am here. The only reason I have some relevance. The only reason I raised money for my startup is because YouTube's algorithm got me discovered, right? I learned how to work with that algorithm, and in 2022 it showed me to 38 million people. It gave me 38 million impressions, which is how many times my thumbnails and titles popped up in people's feeds. And so that's just a blessing. I mean, for a random dude in New Jersey to randomly find 38 million people that see my presence in their consciousness, I mean, that's just, it's unbelievable to describe that. When I think of content, I think of the platform's responsibility, not only from a business perspective, but also from an ethical perspective. If you're amalgamating all of this content to get content creators discovered, like that to me is truly the only thing I care about when it comes to a content platform. 2017, I think Daniel Ek realized that, they needed to go a different direction, and they went into podcasts, and they bought The Ringer, bought Gimlet, bought Call Her Daddy, bought Joe Rogan, exclusive deals with all these celebrities. And as a creator, I personally do not feel like Spotify gives a shit about me, because if they did, I would feel that they would want me to post on their platform and have some mechanism of discovery, which is as simple as putting my thumbnail and title, my cover art for my podcast, whatever you want to call it, in front of people and showing me that they're trying to do that, because they have the users. They got 500 million of them. So if you've got the users, now it's a question of cultivating and curating a feed for random people to get discovered. But instead, they gave 100 million, 200 million to Joe Rogan. They gave a lot of money to Call Her Daddy, gave a lot of money to the Ringer Sports Network. So instead of the underground sports podcast in Kentucky, they're putting Bill Simmons on a spotlight. I get it as a form of content acquisition, top of the funnel brand awareness, get a bunch of people in the door because Joe Rogan's a big fish. He's going to get a lot of users. Long term, I am very confused on how the advertising building a business has a moat. Because if you look at something like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, advertising works because they have trillions of pieces of user-generated content uploaded a second, which means the ad inventory is massive for any search term you can imagine. And then the advertising targeting is just phenomenal because and then you have a rev split, at least with TikTok and YouTube. So, and Instagram starting to do that. So creators have an incentive. In a world in which they are paying for exclusive content, and I, as a creator, and I'm not alone on this, I mean, I've talked to a lot of podcasters, don't feel like there's even a chance to get discovered on that platform. What exactly is the upside to creators joining that platform, deciding they want to post their content there, and then as a result of that, having a massive advertising business on the back of that?
Yeah, I'm just going to push back first on the idea that this is the direction Spotify is always going to go, because it's a little bit of a chicken or the egg problem where if you build that monetization engine, it makes everything a little easier. And that's part of the acquisition strategy with the Ringer, the O&Es that they bring in, Joe Rogan, everything like that, that you have to aggregate massive demand to build an advertising network. And that's sort of the direction they're going on. And it's hard to tell exactly what Spotify is doing on that end. But if you start to piece it together and look at some of their other acquisitions, like Anchor, like Pods, discovery is important. User-generated content is important. There's a reason they started the podcasting push with Anchor. There's a reason they acquired Pods. I do hope that they're going to put that Pods acquisition to work sooner than later to get some of that virality going into podcasts where you can quickly clip a podcast, share it on social media, and drive all this extra discovery outside of the algorithm into social media. And then on top of that, make the algorithm better as well. but yeah, right now I definitely get the idea that if you go into Spotify and look at your feeds, um, A, it's essentially what you've looked at, and B, they do push the ringer, they do push their O&Es. Um,
So I guess
but
I guess I want to push back on the first thing you said, which is this idea that you have to aggregate to build advertising. I haven't seen any social platform ever do that. Like TikTok did not pay people exclusively. Instagram didn't do that. Facebook didn't do that. I mean, even YouTube didn't. Like it seems like those platforms showed the market that anyone can get discovered here by some mechanism, and as a result of that, it allowed more people. I mean, the rise of TikTok is the perfect example, right? Like you see, like I started TikTok a couple of days ago. I'm getting views and engagement, and it's like holy, like this platform is showing my content to other people that means so much to me. It makes me want to post. Why couldn't Spotify just had a they spent $1 billion on podcasts. Why couldn't they have had a $500 million marketing campaign telling people, hey, post your content. We're going to show it to people. And over the past 5 years, just amalgamated tons of user generated content within a feed and then heighten the algorithm that way versus trying to get Joe Rogan in place. And the
yeah,
one caveat is if we believe in the thesis over the next 10 years that user generated content is the future and like the New York Times can't get as much traffic as some of the biggest creators in the world, why wouldn't you put those people on the pedestal? Why are you kind of going back to legacy media and trying to get that as your user acquisition strategy?
I think it just comes back to bringing more and more people into podcasts. I think it's easier to bring non-podcast listeners into podcasting um, if you are leveraging that legacy media, like you talked about, high quality items, and then from there. But to me, it's a dual path for Spotify, where they did start with Anchor. They did start with allowing user generated content to be easily added to Spotify. Right now, they are pushing dynamic ad insertion, all of that, and Spotify sharing revenue with Anchor clients. So they're just starting that. So there's this dual path that I think Spotify is on, that it's not just Joe Rogan and everything else. I'm not super bullish on the Joe Rogan. I think that was Spotify going for the jugular, trying to take over the complete podcast market when they didn't need to. They were already gaining market share. And I think they could have gone for a lower cost path, similar to what you're describing, where it is Anchor, it is pods, it is algorithms. But I do think they're doing that. I
Yeah,
do
because
see that.
Yeah, because it's confusing to me here, right? This is where I struggle. SoundCloud as like 100 million MAUs, and 2014 to 2017 was kind of the era of SoundCloud rappers. If you're kind of in the music world, and Lil Yachty and those guys kind of blew up. Now and Russ, he's a big artist. Now SoundCloud doesn't really make you go viral because I don't know what's happened with it. You don't really see people pop off on it. But 5, 6 years ago, I mean, people were like launching their careers off that platform, and SoundCloud didn't need to aggregate massive amounts of exclusive content. They were kind of known as this underground place to find content, and as a result, they blew up people. Now I wish they stayed that way because we would have more artists being discovered, but nonetheless, it showed that it was possible. Anchor, they bought Anchor. They have all this access to user generated content via that Anchor acquisition, and then it seems like they just forget about it. In terms of showcasing it on the home feed, which is what I mean by forget about it, in order to get Joe Rogan, which begs the question, right? If Joe Rogan left YouTube, and YouTube could not care less because YouTube has so much content that people just keep coming back. And I don't think it's a video versus audio thing. I think it's really a question of there are people that post basically audio content on YouTube, right? It's just them talking in front of a camera. It's like you could consume an audio version, but they post it on YouTube because it can get discovered on YouTube. That's why YouTube is an engine for any type of content in the world. If Joe Rogan decides to leave in 2023 or 2024, and I mean, and those 11 million people that are using it, I mean, I don't know, let's be generous and say 10% of them stay. How do you imagine the platform getting to 1 billion MAUs if now Daniel Ek is in a position where he's realizing, oh crap, the only reason people were using this app is because we had Joe Rogan. And now we got to pay him $300 million to say, because his market value obviously has gone up over the past couple of years, which is, I mean, I don't know how much they're going to make off ads off $300 million. That's a big purchase. Or we let him walk away He takes that audience with him. And now, what is the moat? Why do people come back to Spotify unless they think they have a chance to get discovered, a la TikTok? Like, let's just hypothetically, if Joe Rogan leaves, how does Spotify continue to grow at that point?
Their audience network, the Spotify audience network, and what they're
But
growing.
why would the audience come if the big dogs are, let's say Joe Rogan, Caller Daddy, Gimlet, let's say they all leave, right? Like, why would people come to Spotify if the content's not there?
I mean, the content's clearly there. They have like
The premium content is there, but user generated content is not, right? Like the New York
user
Times Daily podcast, I could listen anywhere. Why would I listen on Spotify?
Why were there 320 million users on Spotify before Joe Rogan ever came?
I would argue the music, right? I mean, like that was back in 2017 when podcast consumption was at an all-time low. I mean, COVID accelerated that, obviously. But I mean, the music, and I agree with you, the music, discovery algorithms, all that stuff. But I'm not, but we've both agreed that music is at best a net income 5% margin business. So to me, that's out of the discussion. Like that's not a bull case for Spotify. It has to be the marketplaces you described, which requires like a lot of user generated content in audio format that people are willing to consume. So my hypothetical thought question to you is if the big guys leave, because like, let's just say they leave, does Spotify buy bigger names or do they try to push user generated content finally? And if they do, how are they going to get people discovered to get people to stay?
Yeah. And I think it goes back to what we've been talking about with Anchor and pods and then the advertising network. Because if the difference between what we're talking about on Spotify versus TikTok, all that kind of stuff, is there's never been a large scale audio advertising network that's really been monetized in a way to reflect the amount of time that's spent listening to it. And so that's where if Spotify can build that in and of itself is a moat. And then on top of that, that's a huge reason for everyone to come to Spotify because the major competitors are going to have a hard time. Google's the prime competitor I see for Spotify, and they're going to have an easier time. But Apple.
Well, this is where I got to push back, and I'm not even worried about Google to be because if Spotify really develops an audio advertising moat, then that's totally fine. My question goes deeper than that. You say the audio advertising network being the best in the world, which I agree they have the chance to create, is what drives people to come. But if they are continuing, and I guess the answer to your question will answer this, if they're continuing to spend $1 billion every couple of years on these exclusive names, why would people come even if there's a phenomenal marketplace of ads? Like for example, I don't post any of my content on Spotify because like I don't see the path to discovery. And the people that have blown up on YouTube that I know have max 5,000 plays and they have 50 million views on YouTube. So like, why would users come if they see Joe Rogan being pushed in the feed, even though there's a chance they could make a couple of dollars off Spotify? Why would they give their content if they don't even think they're going to get discovered? Meaning the way to make those dollars is people have to listen. In order for people to listen, unless you have a big audience that you can push to your Spotify links, the platform has to show it to people. So like, do you think they will stop buying premium and just purely go discovery for user generated, which is again, the incentive for me to post? Or if they're still buying premium, even if they have the best ad network in the world, why would people post if they're not getting the views because Joe Rogan, Caller Daddy are taking up those listening hours?
Yeah, I do think they slow down on their premium.
Okay,
and
gotcha.
I, when you step back and look at it, I think they have been slowing down on the premium as well. From the spree they sort of went on the Joe Rogan, Caller Daddy, and then the kicking it off with Gimlet and Ringer to start. But
Right.
I do think once you have that audio network built, then you can go from there. And the discovery absolutely is a key part because it's good for you're really focusing on the content creators right now when you talk about it. But there's another side to it, and it's the audience, it's the listeners, and showing them other things and getting that discovered really does help
It
push
makes the
it forward.
experience so much better for consumers. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you step back and look at it, they did that for music. They did do that
But it's just not profitable, right? That's the issue.
Yeah, but so things take time, and that's what I've seen it in my job, and I see it with all these big companies. it's always a little frustrating because it's like, okay, they acquired pods 18 months ago. Where is it? It just takes time. You see the testing. If you look at there, you see there's the testing out there, and it looks really cool. Um, but when you're talking 456 million users, that kind of testing, integrating it all into one app takes a lot of time. So I'm being patient on that front. But if I look at the Spotify machine, like they like to call it, and what they've done with music, discovery was a key part of what they did with music, and it is good for the musicians, and it is good for the listeners. And when I look at that, if they hadn't done that with music, I would be a lot more concerned. And if they hadn't been making the Anchor and Pods acquisitions, I'd be a lot more concerned with what you're talking about. Because there is real evidence behind what you're saying. And you just have to go to your home screen to look at it. But there's a lot of evidence that also says that Spotify does understand that in the long run, they need to increase their discoverability.
How do you feel about the playlisting issues I've heard from artists basically saying like, look, if you don't know the guy that knows the guy that knows the guy, it is very difficult to get on a curated playlist given the music labels are paying Spotify to basically keep new artists off the playlist. I mean, net, I agree with you. Like streaming has done way more for brand new artists than like CDs ever could have done. But do you think they could improve on like the politics of getting discovered as a musician in particular with the nature of how playlists are on the platform?
The, yes, you're never going to be quite where everyone wants you to be. It's
Yeah.
just never going to happen. But there are some things, and they've been trying to do it with some of their loud and clear, but it's small steps towards a big problem. But to me, some of the easier things that they can do is really build out some of their analytics for musicians, all that kind of stuff. When you hear the complaints about that kind of stuff, that's the kind of stuff that, okay, take care of that. Those are the easy things that you can really help musicians and really show them, okay, here's the good of streaming. Here's what we can do for you. Discover it, discovery on music. There's always going to be people who are angry. Um, the labels are could just because it's such a valuable thing to be on those curated playlists.
Yeah.
Whoever is not on it isn't going to be happy. So I always got to semi understand that, but then also understand, okay, are they in the right spot? Um, and I think they're close to it. And I think their relationship with the labels, with musicians, I don't think it's in a bad spot, but it's never going to be in a good spot.
Why do you think the labels have a good relationship with them? I mean, net, why do you think the labels like a service like a Spotify? Like, do you think it
Because
just gives their artists more momentum, I
yeah,
guess?
yeah, Spotify makes them a lot of money, and I think that's why they did it. And that when you step back and look at it, they don't have a ton of other choice other than to like Spotify, because that's going to be the ultimate test for a lot of these bull cases. And it's not my bull case, but if a label ever does try to pull back on Spotify, um, it'll be very, very interesting from a music perspective what happens. Because I know with podcasts, uh, if that podcast isn't on Spotify, I really just don't listen to it because Apple Podcasts is terrible. I don't want to have a second podcasting app, all that kind of stuff. With music, it's a little different because music's so much more emotional than
Yeah.
podcasts are. And so I think that would be tough for Spotify if it ever does happen. But it'd be really interesting to watch. But going back to your original question, I think the reason the labels and Spotify get along is because the labels are the ones making a ton of money here. And if that once that starts to change, I could see that relationship shifting. But we're a long ways away from the financial targets that Spotify gave at their investor day.
Okay. Here's an interesting one. Why did Cathie Wood liquidate her position in the stock?
Why does Cathie Wood do anything? you when you look at Cathie Wood's trading history, um, I don't understand it one little bit.
She
Um,
liquidated her position in Palantir, by the way, so I'm in the same boat as you. We both got left
yeah,
with the altar when it comes there.
but that's where, like, when you step back, like, Cathie's interesting. Um, it's fun to talk about Arc, but overall, I'm not considering really Cathie's opinion. Um, when you see some of the stuff she puts out, it just doesn't make sense. Uh, I know you're sort of a Tesla guy, right? And you look at some of their Tesla stuff, it's sort of nonsense.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
when you're
absolutely.
talking about the robo taxis and it's like, okay, I love optionality, but you got to show something before you ever talk about it. And they haven't shown anything. So building that into your massive bull case just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they bought it in the flagship ARC KK Innovation Fund. I think they had over 800, $900 million in it. And then suddenly in June, July, it's just like it's going away. And I know what it feels like to get liquidated because you see like, oh, 20,000, then 200,000. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
she's getting out of this. And I started asking myself that question, why? And I guess they came to the conclusion that it's not as innovative as they thought it was, which is insane because 2 years ago when it's at $300 a share, you think it's incredibly innovative. So it's interesting to see some of the choices she makes and her horizons on making those decisions from a time perspective. Last question for you is the Spotify machine talks about a lot of different verticals they can get into that potentially leads to this like massive level of growth and or monetization. So the two-part question here is audiobooks. Do you think there is a value over Audible when it comes to Spotify because Audible charges like this monthly fee and you can then buy the books there? Do you think people want to buy books on Spotify and listen to it there? And then B, Daniel Ek and Spotify has teased like XYZ other verticals they would get into. Do you have any sense of what those could be to get them to the next leg of growth?
Yeah. Yeah. I do think Spotify does stand a good chance of doing similar to the audiobook industry, what they've done to music, what they've done to podcasts. But this iteration that they put out where you're buying podcasts, and they're sort of locked up by the Apple, it's not user friendly. It's not, I understand why they did what they did. And it's really the book, the, the book industry pushing back because they're sort of scared of Spotify becoming the next Audible.
Right.
Um, but I think it's going to happen over time. And I think if you start to build that audio advertising network, all of a sudden, if those CPMs start to get high enough, all of a sudden the monetization of audiobook streaming makes a ton more sense once you build that audio network. And it will make everything in entering these new verticals a lot easier. So I do think they stand a chance, and I hope Spotify understands that what they've built right now for audiobooks is the first step. But there's no way they're going to dominate the industry with this. Um, so they
Yeah.
got to get a new business model. That's what Cathie would want, disruptive. Because what they have right now is not disruptive. Uh, and
Yeah.
it takes time. And it takes time, especially when you don't actually own that content. But some of I like to go back to their acquisitions to see what they're doing. When you step back and look at some of their acquisitions, they are going after it sort of in a similar model, where I've find a way, Storytel, all those kind of companies, similar to Anchor, where they are getting the content on there. And it's going to be one of those things where if Spotify gets streaming audiobooks on there, even if it's not all of the books that get on there are going to see crazy amounts of use. Uh, and then
Yeah,
once
I
you
mean,
do
if I
that,
can stream a book for free, that means a lot.
yeah,
Historically, books have always costed $20, right? And that's why it's
yeah,
harder. So it's
yeah.
interesting. Yeah. It's basically
And
getting
it's
rid of
really,
albums, almost paying for albums.
yeah, yeah. And so I think there's a lot of chance. I do think it's hopefully just a matter of time. Um, but you got to step back and look at what they did and what they've done in the audiobook industry so far is is a nothing burger. Um, but it's the first step in a larger process when I step back and look at it. And then as your question on other industries, Education is one they've teased a lot. Um, they've also sort of teased like meditation style apps, Calm, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
When you think about it, it's a subscription company, and
Right.
then building advertising on top of that. And so you can go sort of two different directions with that. But I do think those are going to be two of the main ones. But there's potential for video. I've seen some odd odd things that they've been doing, and it's part of the Joe Rogan uh, podcast. Is they've gotten better at actually having video on the app, and then I've also seen podcasts where people are just taking information or videos directly from YouTube and uploading them to Spotify, because you hear within that Spotify, what's up YouTube, uh,
Yeah.
that kind
Yeah.
of.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think video is another
Well, how
vertical.
bullish are you on video? I mean, do you actually catch yourself watching videos, finding new videos? Like, do you think they can become a video discovery I mean, I know that goes against audio, but I feel like they included video just because they were like, all right, it's the same content as YouTube. If you're on Spotify already, you might as well just watch Lex Friedman here versus on YouTube. And they did it as a courtesy. But like the discovery of Lex Friedman kind of happens on YouTube. So I guess how do you think about video on the platform?
Yeah, so I think video could end up being sort of like advertising was, where advertising was just sort of the courtesy. It's just in there, because we gotta have some sort of revenue model for the freemium. And I think over time, it's just in there can evolve into, okay, now it's a real thing. Right now, I'm not a super. I don't like watching video on my phone. And then I do stream a lot through my Spotify app, but once you get music videos, all that kind of stuff, that could be the a first major step, um, to video. So I think there's possibilities there. The labels have that all kinds of tied up, but over time, it's gonna open up more and more throughout time. So I do think videos going to happen. And there was some I've never been able to find it when I heard it, but Spotify actually was first going to start as a video company. I remember hearing Daniel Ek say that. And then they quickly pivoted from that because there was a ton of competition in video. And then they saw everything going on that led to Spotify. Um, but I do think videos one. I think the meditation app is interesting. Education is an interesting one, and they've teased it a lot. Um, but I don't fully see it.
Yeah.
Um, but video to me is a big one that 10 years from now, if you're talking massively bullish, Spotify's one of the top 10 market cap companies. I think video is one of those verticals.
Okay. Last question for you. Spotify Green Room Live, it flopped. I think we can both agree on that. And I think that's because Clubhouse flopped. And now Clubhouse is still around, but I think live audio is just, it's quite frankly, it's not a thing, in my opinion. Do you think there's a world in which live audio succeeds? And I guess, how did you feel about the Spotify Green Room flop, which is what I think it was? Maybe you disagree, but how do you feel about their experimentation with that as a competitor to Clubhouse?
Yeah, I mean, I fully support experimentation. And I think when you step back at their acquisition of Locker Room, uh, yeah, it was not at a crazy overall cost. So to me, it's a risk you take. And part of it is you need to have it in the native Spotify app. And they have said that they're going to do that over time. But having it in a separate app, um, just was never going to work. So I do think they might be, if the next wave comes where live audio hits the next inflection point, I think they'll be ready, and sooner than later, it will be built natively into the app. But to me, it does seem like a niche market. When you start to think about it, it is great for earnings calls. It is
Yeah.
great for sporting events. It is great for things that happen in the moment, and not great for anything else. But if
Yeah.
you start to build it all together and tie it all together with making Anchor easy to record that live audio and give it straight into a podcast, and using it as a tool for creators, just as another option where they can connect with their fans, connect with their it. Part of that makes sense to me, but it's always going to be niche. But when you start to layer all this niche on top of each other, you get to something that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's going to be super, super interesting to see how they play out. All right, FB, thank you so much. I mean, these discussions are, I value them so much because it just helps me understand my own thesis, helps me understand and challenge my convictions. And I think it's fun for people on the internet to widely have access to just two people talking and discussing about, something they might have money into or thinking of putting money into. So awesome stuff. Thank you so much. Where can people find you on Twitter? You want to give out your Twitter @ and then we'll head out from here.
Yeah, I'm at Fat Baby Funds on Twitter, and then my blog is fatbabyfunds.com. And yeah, thanks for having me. It's always great to talk. I love hearing some of the pushback, and I do think you're right on a lot of it, that for Spotify to be successful, they have to be closer to YouTube than they are Netflix. And I think that's where they're heading, even if some of their actions don't look like that on the surface.
Yeah, and personally, I don't own the stock, but I do think it is undervalued from the pure perspective of when we get back to a bull market, things are going to run. And I mean, like, even if you're not in it until 2030, it does seem like at this valuation, it may be a bit undervalued. Granted, it's just the perspective of then of how long are you in it for, and do you really see a bull case? So it's cool. It's a great company, great product. I use the product. It's just a question at the end of the day of, how big can they scale and how fast can they monetize? So awesome stuff. Thank you, FB. I appreciate it.
Right.
I'll catch you in the next one.
Have a good night.
Yep, you too. Bye-bye.